It starts like any other day until it doesn't. A black man, his silver hair gleaming with wisdom earned from decades of service, walks into a courthouse. They think he's nobody, but he's the one person with the power to destroy them legally. It was just after 8 a.m. when Judge Solomon Jefferson stepped out of his modest sedan and approached the Boston Federal Courthouse. The morning sun caught the silver strands of his hair as he adjusted his simple charcoal blazer, well worn but meticulously pressed. At 70, his back slightly stooped from years of military service, he moved with deliberate purpose, each step measured but unwavering. He carried nothing flashy, just a weathered leather portfolio clutched in hands marked by age spots and decades of service. Around his neck hung a barely visible chain, disappearing beneath his collar, carrying military dog tags he never removed. Solomon didn't wear his judicial robe outside the courtroom. He never did. After 30 years in the Navy, rising to captain before retiring, he preferred to enter buildings quietly, observing everything like he'd been trained to do. The habit had saved his life in Desert Storm and later served him well when studying law in his 50s, a career change many called impossible. But today, he wasn't greeted as a judge. He wasn't even seen as a decorated veteran who had broken barriers by becoming a federal judge at 65. He was just another elderly black man walking into a place where power had never come easily to people who looked like him. At the security checkpoint, Deputy Vanessa Caldwell, a court bailiff known for her rigid attitude, narrowed her eyes as he approached the metal detectors. She didn't recognize him, and more importantly, she didn't care to. Something about him bothered her. He looked calm, dignified, like he belonged there. "Sir," Caldwell said, her voice sharp, stepping forward with arms crossed over her crisp uniform. "Need you to step out of line." Solomon paused, his expression revealing nothing of the countless confrontations he'd weathered over his lifetime. "Is there a problem, officer?" Caldwell's eyes swept over him, from his neatly trimmed silver hair to his sensible shoes to the calm but confident look in his eye. She didn't answer immediately. In her world, people like him, old, black, and seemingly frail, needed reminding who was really in charge. "No ID displayed. Can't just shuffle into a federal building looking like that," she muttered. Solomon calmly reached into his blazer and produced his federal credentials. The badge gleamed under the light, but Caldwell barely looked at it before slipping it into her pocket. "I'd like that returned," he said, his voice soft but firm, the same tone he'd used commanding sailors decades ago. She stepped closer. "Are you in a rush to get somewhere, Grandpa?" The word hit like a slap. A younger male guard shifted nervously by the scanner, recognizing the tension, but saying nothing. "I need to get to a courtroom," Solomon said firmly, standing as straight as his aged back would allow. "Then you'll follow my procedure," Caldwell snapped. "That includes random checks. Let's go." With one heavy hand on his upper arm, she steered him toward a windowless screening room. Inside, a steel chair sat in the center with scanning equipment and electric clippers on a nearby table. "I don't consent to this," he said clearly. "You have no legal cause to detain me. You're acting suspicious." "That's cause enough," she replied, motioning to the chair. "Sit down." When he didn't move, 2 officers entered. One grabbed his wrist while another held the chair. "This is a violation. I want your names," Solomon said, his voice rising slightly. Instead, Caldwell grabbed the clippers. "What are you doing?" he demanded. "Standard protocol. You could be hiding something in that silver mop," she said, gesturing to his hair. Hair he'd grown for years after retirement, a symbol of his transition from military precision to civilian life. The clippers buzzed to life. Before he could react, he felt cold metal against his scalp. Silver coils fell to the floor one after another. He didn't scream or cry. 30 years in the military had taught him to endure worse. He sat there, watching his dignity being stripped strand by strand, his face betraying nothing. "Should have shown some respect," Caldwell said, wiping loose hairs from a sleeve. Solomon's voice, when it returned, was steady. "You'll regret this." She leaned down, sneering. "People like you always say that." She opened the door. "You're free to go. Courtroom's that way." He rose slowly, took his badge back without asking, and walked out. His steps were even, his expression unreadable, but in his chest burned something hotter than rage, deeper than humiliation. It was purpose, the same purpose that had driven him through combat zones, through law school at 53, through every barrier society had placed before him. The silence in the hall felt suffocating as he passed two clerks who quickly looked away. They had heard, perhaps even seen, but not one had spoken up. Down the corridor, voices filtered from the courtroom double doors. It was a high-profile morning, a police misconduct hearing involving several officers from a protest incident last year. He was supposed to enter from private chambers, his robe waiting inside, staff prepared. But today, that plan didn't matter. He stopped outside the courtroom, took a deep breath, as he'd learned in military meditation training, then pushed both doors open wide. The courtroom stilled instantly, conversations cut off mid-sentence as heads turned. His shoes clicked loudly against the marble floor as he walked past rows of lawyers, journalists, plaintiffs, and defendants. Some stared in confusion, others in disbelief, as he approached the judge's bench. Then it hit them. The elderly black man they had watched be escorted to the hall like a suspect, the man who bore the evidence of brutality, was not a victim of circumstance. He was a judge. Solomon stepped behind the bench and turned to face the courtroom. His face was calm, the kind of calm that comes not from peace, but from surviving decades of battles, both on and off the battlefield. The bailiff, the same woman who had held the clippers, stood posted by the side door. When he made eye contact with her, she went absolutely still. He didn't flinch. Solomon reached for a robe folded over a chair and slipped it on himself, one deliberate movement at a time. It rested on his shoulders like the familiar weight of his old uniform. A different kind of armor for a different kind of battle. "Is the docket ready?" he asked the court clerk, his voice steady. "Yes, Your Honor," the clerk replied, voice cracking slightly. Solomon nodded once, then lowered himself into his chair. "We will begin today with preliminary testimony on Case 4582D, United States versus Boston Police Department," he said as if nothing had happened. "Charges of abuse of power, excessive force, and civil rights violations." The attorneys shifted in their seats, some wide-eyed, others guilty, and some looked angry. Angry that a black man, elderly and assaulted, had dared return to take his rightful place. He ignored them all. The first witness was cold, an officer who had pushed an elderly veteran to the ground during a peaceful demonstration, breaking two of his ribs. Solomon listened carefully, took notes, asked no questions. Not yet. From the corner of his eye, he saw Caldwell slowly backing toward the rear of the courtroom, her hands twitching nervously. She looked like she wanted to disappear, like she knew her moment was coming. She was right. After the second witness, he called a recess. The courtroom emptied in silence. When only his clerk, two officers, and Caldwell remained, he finally looked directly at her. "Deputy Caldwell," he said, voice sharp as glass. She stopped mid-step. "Yes, Your Honor." "Approach the bench." She obeyed, moving like a woman walking toward a cliff's edge. "State your full name for the record." "Vanessa Caldwell." "And how long have you served as bailiff at this courthouse?" 14 years, Your Honor." "In those 14 years, how many men have you assaulted in that screening room?" he asked, tapping his pen against his legal pad. The color drained from her face. "Your Honor, I didn't know who." "That's not what I asked." She looked around for help. None came. "How many complaints have been filed against you, Deputy Caldwell?" "I'm not sure. I don't." 17. Solomon interrupted, his voice rising in precision, not volume. 17 formal complaints, all buried, all dismissed, because you hide behind procedure and protocol. Her mouth trembled. "I didn't know who you were." And that's the problem, isn't it? He replied, his voice cracking the stillness. You thought I was no one, just another elderly black man you could bully, humiliate, shave for sport. The room fell silent. Because of you, this courthouse has been stained. Because of your actions, the sanctity of this court is now under question. And because you assaulted a federal judge who served this country in combat before you were even born, you are now the subject of a criminal investigation. He turned to the officers standing by the exit. Escort Deputy Caldwell into custody. Formal charges to follow. The officers moved quickly, cuffs already in hand. You can't do this, Caldwell shouted. But she was wrong. He already had. When court resumed, a young intern named Dominic approached during a brief pause. I saw what happened, he whispered, with Deputy Caldwell this morning. I should have said something. I was scared. Solomon didn't answer right away. He studied the young man's trembling hands. Then he said gently, Thank you for telling me. That matters. I didn't stop it. No, Solomon replied. But you're speaking now. That's more than most. The next witness was Terrence Okafor, a black father whose teenage daughter had been injured by police during the protest. As he testified about being ignored when begging for paramedics, Solomon didn't interrupt once. When he finished, he leaned forward. Mr. Okafor, thank you for your courage. I know this isn't easy. I just want to know that it meant something, that someone is finally listening. You've been heard, he said, not from the bench, but as someone who knew exactly what being silenced felt like. That night, Solomon stood in his chambers, staring at his reflection. The mirror showed a man with uneven patches where silver hair had once crowned his head. Decades ago, in Desert Storm, he'd worn his hair military short while facing discrimination, both for his race and his humble background. Later, when he'd finally grown it out in retirement, it had become a symbol of his freedom. Now it was gone again, not by choice, but by force. Yet something in his eyes had changed. The same determination that had carried him through combat zones now burned brighter than ever. When court reconvened the next morning, the atmosphere had shifted. Word had spread about what happened to the elderly black judge who had once been a decorated captain. Reporters lined the gallery. Civil rights attorneys came from across the state. After calling the court to session, Solomon addressed a defense attorney who had risen to speak. Your Honor, before we proceed, we'd like to make a formal request. Due to recent developments? You mean the arrest of Deputy Caldwell and the incident in the courthouse hallway? Yes, Your Honor. These events may present a conflict of interest, a question of judicial impartiality. Solomon stood, walked slowly to the edge of the bench. You're suggesting that because I was assaulted yesterday, I can't carry out the duties of my position. I'm suggesting perception of bias. Let me stop you right there, he said, his voice carrying the weight of 70 years of overcoming obstacles. I was publicly assaulted, not for what I said, not for what I did, but for who I am, because someone saw an elderly black man walking into a courtroom and decided he couldn't possibly hold power. He paused, letting his words sink in. And what did I do in response? I took my seat. I conducted this hearing. I followed every rule, every code of conduct. The attorney's jaw clenched as Solomon continued. You know what real bias looks like, counselor? Real bias is a woman using clippers to shave off a man's hair without cause. Real bias is 17 ignored complaints buried by this very institution. He leaned forward. This court will proceed. I will not recuse myself. Later that day, a former courthouse employee named Gabriela Torres took the stand, revealing how complaints against Caldwell had been systematically buried for years, often with the approval of respected judges. It wasn't just Deputy Caldwell, Torres testified, her voice shaking. There's a pattern here. Anyone who complained was transferred, demoted, or fired. And who authorized these actions? Solomon asked. Torres hesitated, then pointed to a white-haired man sitting in the back row. Chief Administrator Lawrence Whitfield. He said it was easier to move people than to fix problems. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Whitfield, a pillar of Boston's legal establishment, sat stone-faced as all eyes turned to him. "Mr. Whitfield," Solomon called out, "you'll be expected to testify tomorrow morning." That evening, Solomon received an unexpected visitor in his chambers, District Attorney Amani Powell. "Judge Jefferson," she said, closing the door behind her, "I need to speak with you privately." "About?" "They're coming for you," she said, her voice low. "Whitfield has connections to the governor. They're planning to claim you're mentally unfit after the trauma you experienced. They'll cite your age, suggest early-onset dementia." Solomon's expression didn't change. "And why are you telling me this?" Powell placed a flash drive on his desk. "Because 20 years ago, my father was a janitor in this building. He filed a complaint against Caldwell when she roughed up my teenage brother who was just delivering lunch. Dad was fired the next day. No one would hire him after that." Solomon studied her face. "What's on the drive?" "Everything. Every complaint. Every cover-up. Every payoff. I've been collecting it for years, waiting for someone who couldn't be bought or scared." On the final day of the hearing, rain poured outside the Boston courthouse. Still, people came. Reporters, protesters, clerks, witnesses, because everyone knew what was happening wasn't just justice, it was history. Solomon walked into the courtroom in silence. He paused at the front of the bench, looked out at the packed gallery, and then did something unexpected. He took off his robe, folded it gently, and laid it across his chair. He stood there, no longer shielded by title, just a man who had served his country for 30 years before becoming one of its judges. "I've sat behind this bench for years. I've worn the robe, carried the title, but I've also stayed silent longer than I should have, and today I'm done being quiet." He glanced at the defense table, then to the prosecution, then to the courtroom full of citizens. "This court finds Deputy Vanessa Caldwell guilty of abuse of power, violation of civil rights, and official misconduct. But it doesn't stop there." He stepped forward. "This court also recommends immediate review of every complaint ever filed under her name and formal investigation into any official who suppressed them." Then he reached for a folder beneath the desk. "This is a policy proposal effective immediately. I am instituting a mandate for all bailiffs, marshals, and courthouse personnel under this jurisdiction." His voice never wavered. "It's called the Jefferson Mandate. It requires comprehensive anti-bias training, psychological screening, regular evaluations, and a zero-tolerance policy for discriminatory behavior inside federal courthouses." He held it in the air. "I will take this to the circuit, to the judiciary, to the Senate, if I have to, because what happened to me should never happen to anyone." The officers opened the side door, and Vanessa Caldwell walked in, still in cuffs, no longer in uniform. Solomon faced her. "Ms. Caldwell, this court sentences you to the maximum allowable penalties under federal law." His voice dropped, calm but piercing. "You spent your career deciding who was worthy of dignity and who wasn't. You thought the badge made you immune. That people like me, black, elderly, but with more courage and service in our little fingers than you've shown in your entire life, would never hold the gavel." He nodded to the officers. "Take her away." But before they could move, the courtroom doors burst open. Lawrence Whitfield strode in, flanked by two men in expensive suits. "This proceeding is over," Whitfield announced. "By order of the governor, Judge Jefferson is temporarily relieved pending a competency hearing." The courtroom erupted. Solomon remained perfectly still, watching as Whitfield approached the bench. "I'm sorry it came to this, Solomon," Whitfield said, not sounding sorry at all. "But you've clearly been affected by recent events. We're concerned about your well-being." Solomon smiled for the first time since the proceedings began. "Are you, Lawrence? How thoughtful." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small recorder. "Before you continue, you should know that District Attorney Powell and I had a fascinating conversation last night." Whitfield's confidence faltered. "What are you talking about?" Solomon pressed play. Whitfield's voice filled the courtroom. "I don't care what it takes. Get that old man off the bench before he ruins everything we've built. Use the dementia angle if you have to." The color drained from Whitfield's face as Solomon continued. And this morning, I had an equally interesting conversation with the FBI about patterns of corruption, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy against a federal judge. On cue, 4 agents entered the courtroom from side doors. Lawrence Whitfield. One announced, "You're under arrest for conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and intimidation of a federal judge." As Whitfield was led away in handcuffs, Solomon turned back to the stunned courtroom. "Justice isn't just about punishing the guilty. It's about changing the systems that protect them. Today, we've done both." Months later, Judge Solomon Jefferson stood before a middle school classroom. His hair had begun growing back, silver sprouts covering his scalp. A student asked, "Do you still believe in the system?" He paused. "I don't believe in what the system was, but I believe in what it can become. The system isn't just courthouses and laws, it's people. People who choose to speak up or stay silent. People who abuse power or use it to protect others." He touched his growing hair gently. Sometimes justice requires sacrifice. Sometimes it requires you to stand tall when the world tells you to shrink. But most importantly, it requires you to recognize that no one, no matter how old, no matter what color, is nobody. This story reminds us that justice isn't just about punishment. It's about standing tall when the world tells you to shrink. If this story moved you, if it made you feel seen or heard, please don't keep it to yourself. Share with someone who needs hope, and comment below with your thoughts on respect and service. Because justice doesn't end in the courtroom, it begins with us together.